in our speech class. Be heard, be brief, and for God's sakes, be seated. I'll try to keep that in mind as we go along here. I wanted to write one page, it ended up being 4, but it's a large font. My name is John Reddick, and for 22 years, Jack McGrogan was a good neighbor, a good friend, and in the end, he was a hero of mine. I want to thank the McGrogan family, Mary Beth for calling me the other day, Father Steve, my good friend, and Mrs. McGrogan for giving me this opportunity, because knowing your dad is an honor. We had many things in common: our neighborhood, our church, Notre Dame football, Steelers football fans. I did not realize until just the other day when I read the obituary in the paper that your dad was such a good athlete when he was young. You see, Mr. McGrogan, just like my dad, would not talk a lot about his accomplishments. His family was the one exception of that. He and I tried not to take ourselves too seriously. Now, Mr. McGrogan had an affection for the priests and the deacons who served here at St. Paul, and he would talk to me about them all the time. He attended Mass here each morning, and he felt that the weekday congregation was an extension of his family. His grandson, I believe, had an observation. Father Steve had mentioned that Grandpa goes to church every day except Sunday. Now, Jack and I would talk in the alley behind his garage on summer evenings on many occasions, and we rarely talked about serious things. We talked about funny things his sons had talked about. But on one particular evening, I'll never forget it. Our conversation circled around until we started talking about our families. And then for a moment, he got serious. He looked me straight in the eye, and he said, "John, I know I'm not the brightest fellow around here, but I have a lovely wife and 6 beautiful children who have all made it in this world. And I look back and I can't believe how good God has been to me. That's why I go to Mass each morning, to thank God for being so good to me and to my family." It was a wonderful moment for me, and it was a lesson of gratitude that I will never forget. Having 2 teenagers living in my house, this was exactly what I needed to hear at the time. I remember especially not long ago, it was 2 summers ago, I believe, that Mr. McGrogan was really happy. He was feeling really good. And I got to the heart of it. It had to do with his son, Jack. And his son was going to marry a beautiful woman. Now, he didn't go into a lot of details about this, but he told me that Jack had met this lady years ago, and then they were apart for a while, and then they got back together. And I had this sense that somehow he had prayed and prayed about this, and now his prayers were being answered. He loved to laugh and joke about himself all the time. Now, Mr. McGrogan was happily married, and that there is no doubt. But I couldn't help but think that he considered himself a bit of a ladies' man. Now, after his surgery, he was concerned that he wasn't the good-looking fellow that he used to be. Like somehow this stud muffin had lost his mojo. He must have thought for years that because of his good looks, Mrs. Hillard, Mrs. Kemper, Mrs. Kavanaugh, Mrs. Carnahan, and Mrs. Hepler were all watching him all day long. It was kind of 4th Street's version of Desperate Housewives. Before Mr. Kemper's moved away, and Mrs. Kavanaugh and Mr. Hepler are no longer with us, so I guess I'm maybe next in line. Be the stud muffin on 4th Street. It's a tough job, and somebody has to do it. It took some time after Cindy and I moved into the neighborhood to actually get to know Mr. McGrogan. But I would think, who is this fellow with this floppy hat who walked around the neighborhood carrying this tennis ball and wearing a t-shirt that reminded motorists to drive 25 miles per hour? I think I noticed him first up in the North 40. We called it the North 40 at the top of 4th Street in Belmont Road. along the guardrail, and he kept that place just immaculate. Actually, I had noticed it when I first moved to the neighborhood, and Cindy and I could walk by there. And I remember thinking to myself, boy, Butler Township has quite the maintenance program, keeping this grass well-groomed, and they even plant flowers. But then one day I saw Mr. McGogan up there with his lawn boy, working diligently. Later he explained to me how Mim had helped him on so many occasions planting flowers and plants up there, keeping that place so manicured. And how he had won, or had been awarded the key to the city for his efforts. God works in mysterious ways. When I was young, my dad was supervisor of the water company. And one day, my dad's duties that were assigned to him was to assign someone to cut the grass at the water company properties. And often during the summer, on Saturday mornings, my three brothers and I would plow into our truck, and we would drive to Butler with my dad to do some errands. Now, we lived in Herman, and going to Butler was a big deal. And we thought a stop at the Burger Hut before we came home was the goal. That was like maybe large for us. On occasion, though, during those Saturday trips, my dad would make a point of driving by this small piece of property at the top of this hill at a place where he called the reservoir, to make sure that the grass was mowed the way he expected it to be. Because you see, my dad was very particular about lawn care. I was young, living in Herman. I had no idea where we were. Years later, after Cindy and I had moved to 4th Street, I realized that that property at the top of the hill was the same property that my dad was stopping to see when I was young. When Mr. McGrogan got older, he asked if I knew anyone who would be willing to take over that task for him. I said without hesitation, I'll do it. That was 6 years ago. I expanded the scope of work just a little bit for a small section on the reservoir side of the road because I thought my dad would be happy about it. When I work up there, or when I run by or ride my bike past that little piece of property, or I walk by holding my wife's hand, I think of my dad, and I think of Jack McGrogan, because it reminds me of who they were and who I am. It's funny, today is December 10th. Today is my dad's birthday. If he were alive today, he would have been engaged. God works in mysterious ways. You know, life isn't meant to be easy. We may even question at times if God exists, or does he really care about us? There's nothing new there. Nothing new at all. Jesus Christ himself, in a moment of despair, cried out, my God, why have you abandoned me? Boy, the older I get, the more experiences I have, I am convinced that if we pay attention, if we take the time to listen, God is with us. He's guiding us, he's helping us, he's tugging us, he's trying his best to draw us closer. In this difficult life, surely sometimes we feel something that goes beyond ourselves. When we're here at Mass, when we hear something or consider something beautiful, when we're working hard in the backyard, when we're running around the athletic field, or when we realize God's presence and his guiding hand when we see our children grow and find success in this world. You know, if we really need proof of God's care for us, he sends someone to us, a spouse, a father.